Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. There we go. A little better. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is DeJuan Baker. I serve as our Associate Athletic Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn, where we are talking through details, the history, the context of the conflict that is currently happening with Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And so thank you very much for lending your time and your attention, your energy. I have a fantastic panel here with me today to give us a little bit of context in regards of how it is that we can be more educated of what's going on, and also just kind of building, again, the history of how October 7th really came to be, right? And so we'll definitely give an opportunity to introduce our panelists. Directly to my right is Dr. Nabil Shaibi. He's an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies and a director of the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture here at CU Boulder. His research and focus is teaching on media, religion, and the politics and poetics of Muslim visibility and decolonial theory. And lastly, his opinion columns have been published in The Guardian, Forbes, Al Jazeera, Salon, Latino Rebels, and the Religion Dispatches and publications in France and Morocco. And that's Dr. Nabil. Directly in the center with us is Dr. Hilary Kalisman. Dr. Hilary is an assistant professor of history and endowed professor in Israel and Palestine studies in the program in Jewish studies here on campus. Her research focuses on the history of education in Israel, Palestine, Iraq, Jordan, and the broader Middle East. Dr. Hilary. And lastly, on my very end is Dr. Kareem Matar. Kareem is an associate professor of English at CU Boulder, and he works on the comparative Middle Eastern literatures and cultures, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and humanism. And that's Dr. Kareem. And so as we get started today, we always like to set ground rules with a lot of our programs here in DEI. Our main ground rules today are to, one, be respectful. We recognize that this is a very, very complex issue that has a lot of history that's tied to it that may have varying opinions and perspectives. We want to be respectful of the different experiences that are in the room. Active listening, so listening to what our panelists have to say and really leaning into what their expertise is, and really understanding that they have years of experience in learning about and educating others around what these topics are. A brave space, we know that we utilize safe space in athletics pretty frequently. But the brave space for us here is really creating a space for us to learn. So if there's a question that you have that would really lend to your learning, we want to allow you to be brave enough to ask what that question is to really get the education and the answer that you need to build a full opinion for yourself. And then lastly, use I statements. Again, we know that, we know that these experiences are not a monolith. They do not blanket everyone who comes from specific areas or regions. And so if you have a specific experience or something that really sits with you or hits with you, please use I statements and don't blanket that to other individuals as well. And so definitely want to preface that, and again, thank our panelists for being here. We'll ask them a few questions, and then at the end, we'll turn it over to the audience to have questions as well. DeAndre, I'm gonna ask you to raise your hand if you don't know DeAndre, who's in the back of the room. DeAndre has a mic, and then Tommy, who is on a run right now, will have a mic as well to be able to run a mic to you if you have a question. And so, again, thanks for your time and energy. We'll kick off our panel, and really want to start with Hilary. And Hilary, if you can explain to us just a general overview of the history of kind of the conflict that's going on, and why are people fighting in Israel and over the Gaza Strip specifically?
So, is this better? Okay. So basically, the area that becomes the Gaza Strip has a fascinating early history. It's ruled over by pharaohs. It's important in the biblical period. It's part of a trade route to Egypt. But in terms of its more recent history, basically after World War I, it's part of the Mandate for Palestine. And so the Mandate for Palestine is basically a guardianship, which means Britain has control over this area. And the idea is that Britain will facilitate this area becoming a nation state and then Britain will leave. Now, in reality, it's also a way for Britain to maintain its own interests in the region. They also include in the text of the Mandate for Palestine something called the Balfour Declaration. And what this says is that the Britain will facilitate a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A why does this end up happening. But essentially, this area is sort of, and it's majority Arab Palestinian. Gaza is a sort of integral part of the Mandate. It's its own administrative unit. Then in 1948, you have the end of the Mandate, you have Israel's War of Independence, and you have Palestinians' Nakba. And basically, the area that is Gaza becomes filled with Palestinian refugees leaving the area that becomes part of Israel, fleeing it, being expelled from it. They end up there, right? And so then this question becomes, well, so who takes this territory? Egypt is not particularly interested in it. It doesn't have a lot of strategic value. It's also filled with refugees. So David Ben-Gurion, who's the first prime minister of Israel, actually puts forth a proposal to annex it, but he says he will only take 100,000 Palestinian refugees as Israeli nationals, and that's less than half of the number of refugees that's actually just in Egypt at that time. So basically, Gaza ends up being an occupied territory, but under Egyptian control, but Palestinians living there don't become Egyptian citizens. It's a separate thing. In 1967, Israel defeats sort of the surrounding Arab countries in a very brief war and takes control over it. But again, you have this question of what do you do with this population? There are many Palestinians living there. Israel is concerned with maintaining a Jewish majority state. You cannot make these people citizens and have it maintain a Jewish majority state. So Israel occupies that area. So skipping forward, and one of the other things is it moves settlers, Jewish settlers, into that area. So skip ahead to 2005. Israel decides to withdraw its settlements and allow Gaza to sort of nominally be run by Palestinians, to have its day-to-day workings be taken care of by Palestinians. There are a lot of different reasons behind it. Part of it is the idea that this will make Israel more secure. Also, part of it is those settlements are less valuable to sort of more religious Jewish Israelis, because Gaza is not like a, sort of part of a biblical homeland. Areas of the West Bank, many religious Jewish Israelis think are. So they decide to withdraw. 2006, they have elections. In these elections, they elect Hamas, right? What is Hamas? Hamas is originally it's originally a terrorist organization. It's founded in 1987, but then its sort of idea is like, okay, well, other Palestinian organizations aren't resisting strong enough. We're going to resist more. We're also going to resist in an Islamic idiom. By 2006, they decide they're going to try to run as a government party, right? And they run on a platform of no corruption, which has been a huge problem for other Palestinian entities. And they are elected, and they actually sort of have a go at being a government. But very quickly, it doesn't work out. Nobody wants to work with them because they are a terrorist organization, even if they do other stuff. And you end up having a blockade on Gaza. Since Hamas gets elected, they refuse to hold any other elections since then. So that's kind of a still long but quick overview of kind of what's the sort of history of Gaza generally.
Thanks for that terrific overview, Hillary. A couple of points are important to recognize. Of the 800,000 Palestinians who were forcibly expelled from their home in the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine, per the Jewish Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, many of them ended up in Gaza. Of the 2.3 million Palestinians there, they are originally refugees, and at this moment they're facing a similar kind of process of being made refugees once again. I really appreciate your history up to 2006, but it is important also to demonstrate the enormity of the blockade on Gaza by the State of Israel and Egypt since 2006. It's a comprehensive land, sea, and air blockade. And please excuse my nasal voice. I have a bit of a cold, which adds insult to the injury of my British accent. So I apologize for that. Comprehensive land, sea, and air blockade, where food, medical supplies, water, and all sorts of things necessary for building and developing the civilian infrastructure in Gaza have been severely prohibited by both Israel and Egypt. And in this period, up to today, there have been 5 catastrophic wars on Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2018, and 2021. Where the civilian infrastructure of hospitals, schools, power plants, sewage facilities, residences, and so forth has been systematically targeted by the Israeli military, leading to approximately 10,000 deaths, including 1,000 to 2,000 children's deaths in this period. This is a brutal and bloody blockade punctuated by these catastrophic wars, and it's, I think, important to recognize the severe deprivation of Palestinian life, to properly contextualize and understand the Hamas's atrocities on October the 7th and Israel's response to them. These are all part of a longer pattern of back and forward between Israel and the anti-Semitic terrorist organization Hamas, and it is rooted in deep and persisting human suffering in the Gaza Strip, half of whose 2.3 million population are children under the age of 18.
So with that, you mentioned there have been categorized essentially multiple things that you would call war, dated from 2006 all the way up to October 7th. Would you call what's going on as of as of October 7th, do you categorize what is happening a war? And if so, what's the thought process behind it?
So I would say, and I think this is also something that you reminded me of, which is really important, this is not a war between 2 states, right? So when I say like Hamas had a go at being a government, they're not a sovereign state, right? Like Israel has controlled not only the blockade to disastrous humanitarian consequences, but also taxes. You know, sort of basically like the basic functioning of a government is something that Gazans have never had control or sovereignty over. So what this means is you have to take into account the fact that Hamas is a non-state actor, right? So in a certain sense, you know, because again, generally war tends to imply a battle between different governments, between different states with standing armies. This is not that. That said, you do have one standing army involved, you do have a lot of weapons involved, and you know, there are certain parallels to, you know, sort of other historical battles with non-state actors that have been defined as war as well.
I just wanted to add something because I think what Hillary said is important to underline, that they're not a state player. And if you look at the Washington Institute poll that has been conducted in Gaza by this independent body that is run by Dennis Ross, who was the envoy of the United States to the Middle East, and particularly around the question of Israel and Palestine. If you look at the poll that has been conducted since 2014 and was conducted just recently in July of 2023, you'll see that a vast majority of the people in Gaza have expressed their desire not to be run by Hamas. This is really important because what we're hearing in the media is that people in Gaza are fully supportive of Hamas. They are not. More than 70% expressed the desire of the Palestinian Authority, which is running the other side, which is the West Bank, to come in and remove Hamas and then end the bloodshed. Not that the Palestinian Authority is better politically necessarily, but it's just that they don't want to be living under those conditions where there is a constant conflict and a constant war with Israel.
So we talked a little bit about the political structure and just kind of the history and the context of how it came to be. I believe it was either this week that President Biden came out and said that the U.S. will stand with Israel. And you mentioned that there's been a lot of media attention in regards of, what people are saying about the conflict as a whole. From your lens, what is the U.S. involvement, or what is at stake for the U.S. to be actually invested in what's going on with Israel and the Gaza Strip and Hamas?
So I think one thing to keep in mind is actually, to a certain extent, the U.S.'s role in some of the factors that precipitated Hamas acting now, right? So Hamas, I think, has been concerned about being sidelined by diplomacy between Israel and other Arab countries, right? The U.S. has been pushing these Abraham Accords since the Trump administration. And with these accords, basically, the U.S. sort of helps sweeten the pot for Israel to be recognized by other Arab countries. And the most recent country that the U.S. was sort of courting on Israel's behalf is Saudi Arabia. And so it's something with Hamas, and also with Palestinians in general, right? Like the discussion of what to do with Palestinians, their statehood, their sovereignty, their humanitarian conditions has not really come into play with these Abraham Accords. It's been an agreement between states sort of pushing the Palestinian problem under the rug. And so it's something where the U.S., in that extent, has led to a situation where Hamas feels the need to act. And again, in a horrible, unjustified way. That said, also, generally, the U.S. has been a staunch supporter of Israel since 1967, since that war, right? The U.S. has given Israel billions of dollars in aid. And there is a strategic value to that, right? The U.S. has had a country in the region that is a close ally that it counts on. On the other hand, and again, it makes sense that also it's a more politically popular position, right? You saw, I think the U.S. Senate voted unanimously to sort of support I Stand With Israel, and they don't do anything unanimously, right? They couldn't agree on daylight savings time or whatever. So it's something where it's a politically popular decision. That said, you are also seeing ire against the U.S. in other countries because of this decision, because the U.S. is seen as coming out unilaterally on the side of Israel. And there's also been questions and sort of protests on the part of Americans, on the part of Jewish Americans, on the part of Israeli Jews also about the current Israeli government, which is sort of the most right-wing and most religious in Israel's history. So up until these sort of attacks, you had Israelis who had been protesting for months and months and months about, sort of more domestic Israeli politics, but ones where basically the idea was that the Supreme Court in Israel would lose power in favor of the Israeli parliament, which for many individuals was seen as a way of undercutting Israeli democracy, such as it is. And so I think with the US context, it's something where what Israel does reflects on the US also. And I think the US has failed to use its possible leverage on Israel to help Israel make better long-term decisions, both for itself and for US interests, and for all of the Palestinians who are suffering horribly with it as well.
Just briefly, it's important to recognize the depth of Jewish American sympathy for Israel. This was a state founded in the wake of the European Holocaust, of course. Many European Jews emigrated to the newly founded state of Israel in the wake of 1948, and of course many emigrated there beforehand during the mandatory period, and indeed during the period of Ottoman control over historical Palestine. But these are bonds in the American Jewish community of love based on the historical experience of anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States, and of course rising phenomenon in the contemporary West, given the emergence of far-right governments and politicians throughout these countries. So it's an emotional bond, I want to stress, in addition to being a political bond.
So I think we've seen too, or at least I would assume that we've seen that a lot of the spillover to the U.S. has really caused, a lot of friction and a lot of action as well. With recently, a young Palestinian child who was 6 years old, Wadia Al-Fayoum, was killed by somebody, and his mother was stabbed as well by somebody who was trying to take a stand, right, against Palestine and individuals from that background. And so we've seen people really take action because of what is happening, with the conflict as well. Are those things that you've seen as well, or do you foresee that will continue to happen in the U.S. specifically?
So I think it's fair to establish a direct link between the inflammatory rhetoric that has pervaded our media, but also that our politicians are spreading. And if you think about how our politicians are speaking, it's totally irresponsible to think of what Lindsey Graham, the senator, said about flatten Gaza on his social media, or to say that Gaza has to look like Tokyo and Berlin after the end of the Second World War, and if Israel does not do that, it will be a huge mistake. Or if you have another senator, Tom Cotton, who says, bounce the ground, Israel has to bounce the ground, which is an expression that Winston Churchill used against the danger of nuclear arms and nuclear weapons. But he used that to say that I am, act disproportionately and then bounce the ground. And then you have multiple other politicians who said as much. Anywhere from Governor DeSantis, who said act disproportionately, to others. Marco Rubio also had some very, very harsh words. And also people who came out to say, including the Republican representative who is the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress, who came out and said, I saw these videos of Israeli children in metal cages, and Hamas fighters are outside and they're laughing at the misery of these kids in these cages. And when he was confronted, he could not produce the evidence. It turned out that that video, actually, that was circulating on social media, was created by one of the leaders of the far-right movement in the UK. Once you get these stories out and you want to walk them back, it becomes really, really problematic and very difficult. So this landlord who came into the house of a family in Chicago or outside of Chicago admitted that he was listening to this rhetoric. He was listening to far-right radio. He was listening to these politicians. And when he bludgeoned these kids 26 times after hitting his mother and almost killing his mother, he said, all Muslims have to die, that Palestinian kids should not be allowed to grow up. And if you think about other politicians who said something that is very similar to this, who said, well, this is Senator, not Senator, but Governor DeSantis, he said, we should make sure that we understand, all of us, that all Palestinians are Hamas supporters. I just shared with you that poll that said quite the contrary. So there is a direct link between the media, the political rhetoric, and these kinds of very unfortunate incidents that keep happening.
I just want to add briefly, so Karim alluded to this, right? But there's also, so people have talked, he mentioned the very strong emotional ties between Jews living worldwide and Israel. One of the other things is that Israel, as the Jewish state, right, as a state which is majority Jewish, which is, sort of speaks about being a Jewish state, and part of its, raison d'être is that it is supposed to be a refuge for Jews worldwide. Its actions, therefore, also reflect on Jews, right? So when people are angry at Israel, that also means they tend to have that anger extend to Jewish people, whether or not those are Jewish people who are protesting the government, whether or not those are secular, religious, tangentially Jewish, etc. So it's something where this is also a time of rising anti-Semitism in the wake of both the attacks, but also, sort of Israel's actions and reprisals. I mean, it's something where my children's Hebrew school now has a police car outside of it instead of the normal security, right? And it's something where this is very far from Israel. This is Boulder, Colorado, but it is also a climate where, again, like irresponsible politicians and individuals are getting more of a platform in the wake of these events.
A quick, unfortunately not so minor correction to a comment Nabil made. The boy, Wadi, was not bludgeoned, he was stabbed 26 times, as was his mother. And in light of Hillary's very important comment, it is important to distinguish between Judaism and the actions of the State of Israel, a political entity which has been involved in various, or has contributed to a Palestinian humanitarian crisis, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, historically, up to the present. Those who seek to conflate Israel and Judaism itself as a religion often fail to distinguish between the actions of a state which is subject to international law, humanitarian law, and so forth, and those for whom the state seeks to speak. So that distinction is important to keep in mind. Regarding the wider atmosphere, political and media-generated atmosphere here in the United States, a comparison has, of course, been made with the national mood in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, a period of rising Islamophobia where the FBI and political leaders went out of their way, seemingly, to conflate the actions of a specific terrorist group and Islam as a religion as a whole. Hamas does not speak for Islam, it does not speak for Palestinians, it does not speak for Arabs. So maintaining that distinction in one's mind is important when these kinds of attacks and the threat of a wider cultural attack on Islam as a religion which historically, over the 1400-year period of its civilization throughout the Middle East and the South Mediterranean and the Near East, did not contain a single ounce of anti-Semitism. A religion under whose dominions Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived peacefully side by side up to 1948, while Europe was developing the language, logic, institutions, and mechanisms of anti-Semitism under the Shoah. It is important to remember this deep cultural heritage of Islam in that part of the world, in contradiction to, or in contrast to, the primarily European phenomenon of anti-Semitism.
So I want to jump ahead really quick to a question that we have listed, because we talked a lot about media, right? And because of how influential storytelling can be and how it is that we're producing these stories for the U.S. and for the world, from your lens, where is a good place to get media about the conflict? That might be more fact-telling, that might be more historical context, or even just, again, us being a little bit more intentional on getting the sheer facts of the situations that are happening.
Yeah, that's an important question. I think this is an issue that is very divisive and also incendiary on so many levels, because people are carrying intergenerational trauma in their families on both sides. And it's very fair to always pause and think, okay, what am I doing in order either to heal some of that trauma, or what am I doing to inflame and make people suffer even more? You know, you told us to use the I a little bit more, so I'm going to go ahead and break with the rule of sort of the academic and talk a little bit more about my personal experience. I grew up in Morocco. I was born and grew up there, and I came here for my grad studies. So for me, I just want to say this statement because it's important to think that if I sound angry, it's not because I want to prolong the trauma. It's not because I want to blame one side against the other. It's because of the way in which we experience these things. And so I would say, first and foremost, that the day I, as an Arab, as a Muslim American, will feel totally oblivious and indifferent to the pain of a mother who is grieving the loss of her child in a Hamas attack, or the fact that her child is in custody or has been, abducted. The day I feel indifferent about that, I will have lost all humanity, and there is nothing you could salvage about me. And I will never forgive myself for that. Now, having said that, the problem is most of us feel once we say this, what comes after that statement is of no interest to anyone else. Because what we want to say is there is another side to that. It's once I have sided with that grieving mother, and I don't want that to be visited on anyone, anywhere, what I'm going to say is there is also a grieving mother on the other side who's asking questions, who's writing on the hands and arms of her child in Gaza their name so that they be recognized if the parents are dead, right? So just think about that for a while, about this is what this conflict has become, right? So it is our responsibility to look for information. We cannot just be lazy consumers of media. We cannot accept the fact that CNN goes to Tel Aviv and then puts on the, they go to the terrace of a five-star hotel in order to report from there, and the graphic on the CNN website screen, or any screen for that matter, of any Western media organization, is Israel at war. You completely negate the other side, which is the Palestinian, because they are also at war, right? And Hamas does not represent, as we heard, does not represent Palestinians, right? So how do we correct these things? It starts with us. And you have to think really twice, and I'll start with myself. If you find a tweet that you feel is very irresponsible, before you hit that like or you hit that repost or whatever it is, you have to think twice about what that actually can do, because it can lead to a really dire and incendiary situation that is already very problematic and very dangerous. So where do we look? There are plenty of places where we can look that are really doing fair and responsible journalism. The first people that I go to are the Israelis themselves. Haaretz newspaper has really good commentary and columnists who are writing, who were correspondents or are correspondents in the occupied territories, who are saying really interesting things. I would start with this name, Amira Hass, H-A-S-S, right? Who was yesterday on Democracy Now!, who says really interesting things about what's going on. She said, we cannot be drunk on mighty vengeance. And as the child of parents who actually survived the Holocaust, she says, I cannot allow myself to repeat this history to someone else. Even in smaller proportions, I would not. And she started crying right there. This is someone who is a 40-year veteran of journalism, who comments on life in Israel as well as in the occupied territories. So yes, you have to look at both sides. I'm not reading just Palestinians. I'm not reading just Arab newspapers and magazines. I'm also reading on the other side. And there are plenty of others who have, illuminated for me that relationship and the experience, the lived experience of everyone. Yeah, so I'd say the responsibility starts with us and not with the media. It starts with us because we are the target of the media.
Hillary, Green, anything you want to add? So before we transition to opening for questions, final two questions for me. First, Hillary, you mentioned earlier how there's a very, very strong tie to just the humanitarian and the human rights aspect on this conflict. What are some of the things and the consequences to the conflict that is going on from a human rights perspective?
The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has been going on for 16 years at the very least. This is an acceleration, what we're seeing now, the war in Gaza, of an already existing system of blockade interspersed with brutal and bloody wars that have destroyed civilian infrastructure and civilians on the ground in Gaza. The latest news is that President Biden is attempting to open a humanitarian corridor between Gaza and the state of Egypt, and he's raising $100 million in order to facilitate this. The talks between the Israelis, the Americans, the Egyptians are complicated. My understanding as of this morning is that aid will not be forthcoming today. At least we have to pay close attention to the situation as it continues to unfold in the next couple of days with the projected ground invasion of Gaza about to take place. It's important to note also the comments of the Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, who called Palestinians in Gaza, not just Hamas, the civilian population of Gaza, human animals on October the 8th in the wake of the terrorist attack on South Israel, and who immediately called a halt to water, food, and medical supplies from entering into the Gaza Strip. This has been loosened a little bit, and President Biden, in his meeting with the Israeli administration over the last couple of days, has forcefully insisted that Israel must follow the rules of international law when it comes to warfare, which adversely impacts the civilian population. And I believe it's American political responsibility, given its influence on Israeli politics, to maintain a close attention on the humanitarian situation when these kinds of actions have already been conducted by the Israeli government and military, and in a context where Israeli politicians, including members of the Knesset, have called for a second Nakba. Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe, and it refers to the forced expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians from their homes in historical Palestine in 1948, and members of the Knesset have called for a similar thing happening in Gaza today. When the Ministry of Defense issued an evacuation order last week, they called for 1.1 million Palestinians to evacuate northern Gaza to the south so as to facilitate the ground invasion and the rescue operation. We haven't mentioned the 200 to 250 Jewish Israeli civilians who have been captured and made hostages by Hamas. Israel's primary objective is to release these hostages, but in order to facilitate this, they called for a 24-hour evacuation, which is, per the United Nations and per international human rights organizations, just logistically impossible and would lead to mass civilian casualties. So we have to pay attention to all of these questions, and in my opinion, American politicians need to pay close attention to the implications of this ground invasion so as to maintain the legitimacy, such as it is, of Israel's actions.
And I just wanted to add briefly, I think one thing I have to disagree with is I don't think the Israeli government's main objective is returning the hostages. I think this is something that is actually rather unfortunate. So one of the things we've seen in previous wars with or on Gaza is, sort of after every bombing, Israel sort of makes an announcement that says this was the value of this particular target, right? Yes, like these civilian lives were lost, but we were able to kill this particular militant, we were able to take out this particular facility. We're not hearing that right now. We are just seeing fairly, to my mind, indiscriminate-looking attacks, which again, it makes it look like the Israeli government is doing something in the wake of failing to protect its citizens from this horrible terrorist attack. But I'm not seeing a very strong long-term military strategy other than the possibility of another Nakba. I mean, it's something where if you are, and again, the population of Gaza, when they're being told to leave their homes and move south, they're afraid they won't be allowed back. And again, from the Israeli side, I have not heard a lot about how whatever it is they're doing is going to bring back these hostages. It mainly seems, and it may be because they do not have the sufficient intelligence. This was a huge intelligence failure. But what I see now is sort of a tactic of, it seems, revenge and the desire to look like you are taking some action, but without consequences that are necessarily beneficial for Israel and certainly not beneficial for the people in Gaza.
Last question, and we'll turn it over to the audience. Very briefly, how can we continue to support individuals who are impacted by the conflict, whether that is here at CU, here within this room? What are ways that we can continue to make sure that they have the support necessary to continue to really live and thrive within the conflict, if possible?
Yeah, I think one thing is to listen to people and to provide spaces where people can actually talk freely and create those friendly spaces where people would feel comfortable to share. And to look for the people who are affected by this also directly. We have students and we have faculty who are from Gaza with us. I have 2 PhD students I'm working with who are from Gaza. They can't sleep, they can't eat, they can't do anything. One of them, their home has been destroyed. They don't know where they're gonna go. I have another PhD student from Israel who lost friends and family in the attack. So they are out there. We need to be able to reach out to them if we know who they are and listen to them because they're hurting. I don't think centrally as a university we have done a good job to actually reach out to these folks. And it's not necessarily that they're requiring us to issue statements or sign petitions and things like that. I mean, we can do those things. Those are wonderful things to do. But I think that what they want really from us is and just the capacity to listen to them and to hear what they have to say because they have important things to say. And they need to also unload a lot of anxiety, as I said, intergenerational trauma that needs to be brought out. So I would start here before we go and think, how can I help people there? I think we could start small, and that is going to help heal some of these conflicts over a longer period of time. And I think that that's what, hopefully, what we are all looking for is to heal this so that we don't repeat it and reproduce it over and over and over again.
Thank you all for your answers, your expertise. For anyone in the audience, if you have questions, happy to turn them over to the panelists and be able to provide some additional perspective and thoughts. Deandra has a mic in the back if anybody's willing to ask any questions.
Thank you so much for being here and taking your time to educate us. How is the perception of Western or specifically U.S. engagement in the area taken internally?
You mean by Israel and Palestine?
Yes.
Mixed across those lines. Nabil mentioned the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the oldest newspaper in Israel, a liberal broadsheet. In effect, the Israel's version of the New York Times, there's been some solid coverage about how grateful and appreciative Israelis have been for President Biden's visit the last couple of days. His statement of comprehensive United States support for Israel at a moment of deep national crisis and mourning has been appreciated by the wider Jewish Israeli public. We have to remember there are 2 million Palestinians who are living in Israel independently of the West Bank and Gaza. So among Jewish Israelis, this has been deeply appreciated. And in fact, much of the coverage suggests that Biden's leadership demonstrates the deficiencies of the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership. Many Israelis, about half the country, have been systematically protesting for the last year against the far-right coalition he put together in December of last year. On the Palestinian side and the Arab side, all of the Arab countries surrounding Palestine and Israel have been deeply critical of the US's and Western Europe's statements of unequivocal support, not for Israel in its moment of crisis and mourning, but for the statements made by certain members of the Israeli administration regarding leveling the entirety of Gaza, the green light or the carte blanche that it appears the Western powers have given Israel to do what it needs to do in the entirety of Gaza has been met with deep criticism and hostility in much of the Arab world. There have been protests in major cities from Amman to Cairo to Beirut and further afield. The sense of cynicism towards the United States intentions in the Arab public sphere has been accentuated by what we've been seeing at, for example, hospitals in the Gaza Strip over the last couple of days. This morning, a Baptist church, which was a 1600-year-old church, was bombed, killing 18 Arabs in there. And with the continuing of, with the continuing of these, what appears to the Arab mind as the intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure and civilians in Gaza, public support for Israel and America will continue to deteriorate to a point of possible deeper regional crisis.
What's also interesting is that, and I think this is new, is the large demonstrations in Western capitals and non-Arab capitals as well. Berlin, Paris, London, even though in London and Paris, the authorities had barred people from showing any any solidarity with Palestinians in large demonstrations, but people did come out nonetheless. But also other places like Seoul in South Korea, and that's fairly new. Usually, Arab streets will be filled with demonstrations, but now we're seeing demonstrations elsewhere. And I think that's, you don't see this as much on American media or Western media, but if you watch media elsewhere, you'll see that there is a wide support for Palestine and a critique. Solidarity with Israel, but critique, right? Sort of solidarity does not preclude critique, and critique should not preclude solidarity. I mean, you could show both. And there are multiple places where this is happening. And it doesn't really help when the media are not showing these things, because it's important to understand that the implications of this conflict are truly, truly global. And that it's not just between Arabs, and Israelis, or between Palestinians and Israelis. You were asking earlier about the implications, political implications. They are huge, and we should get informed because there are consequences to these things.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'd like to thank you all for being here as well and sharing your time with us and your perspectives. One of the first questions that came to my mind is, what was Hamas trying to accomplish, and were they successful? It seemed to be a very well planned out and organized attack. Is that something that they foresaw what was going to happen following? You know, what are your thoughts on what were they really trying to accomplish?
So I would say, very briefly, one of the things I have read is that they were more successful than they thought they were going to be, that they were not expecting to kill that many people, to take that many hostages, that they were unprepared. That said, you know, sort of, I think I would like to, you know, kind of make a separation between their kind of tactics and some of the rationale behind them. Because I think one of the things we've seen, right, is again that the question of Palestinian sovereignty, citizenship, humanitarian issues has been sidelined. And it's something where I think that has been in part a tactical strategy on the part of the Israeli government, because Palestinians generally don't have a lot of leverage, right? Israel doesn't have a lot of incentive to offer concessions. If you are in control of an area, if things are not that bad, if your citizens are able to go around, your Jewish citizens anyway, to go about their daily lives without worrying about what's going on in Gaza, why would you give up anything? And now we're in a situation where that is not sustainable. It has never been sustainable. But I think for Hamas, I mean, and again, I think they have extremely selfish aims, which are trying to make sure that they are someone that needs to be dealt with, that they are important again, that they get more funding because they're seen to be successful in attacking Israel. But on the other hand, I think it points to a need for a long-term solution, to not just be like any, you know, because it's much easier to form a political agreement with a sovereign state, right? That state already has a territory. It's set up, you can just agree with them, you can pay, and then we're all set. There needs to be a long-term solution with Palestinian self-determination and sovereignty for Israel to be safe. And again, Israel's safety is not Hamas's objective, but I think that's one of the really crucial issues that this raises. And I think that's something I really hope also the US government is keeping in mind, is that you can't just keep applying a Band-Aid and hoping that Palestinians will somehow go away or make a new solution. You have to think long-term about how to actually make peace between them.
I just had a question kind of off of that. What do you think is a realistic solution going forward? Obviously, it's early in the conflict, so hard to tell. But do you think it's Israel honoring the Oslo Accords, or do you think there's any possibility of that happening at this point in time?
Take this quickly. The international consensus per the Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 comprised a two-state solution with an independent Palestinian state made out of some kind of conjunction between the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza. The settlement enterprise in the West Bank has made this seemingly a logistical and pragmatic impossibility. However, this is the international consensus, and the alternative option of a one-state solution premised on civil society institutions and organizations that aim to rebuild the ancient bonds between the Jewish and the Arab people is achieving further visibility at this moment, as it has been for the last couple of years. Whether October the 7th makes this perhaps utopian possibility for the future of Israel and Palestine an impossibility, that seems likely. However, however we approach this issue politically, some kind of resolution for the question of Palestine and Palestinians. 7 million of them live in the combined territory of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, must be found so as to stop, as Hillary was very articulately and beautifully saying, this terrible, terrible, terrible cycle of violence between two Semitic peoples inhabiting the same space.
I just want to go back to the question that you asked because I think it's an important one. And Hillary answered it really well, but I just wanted to add one more thing, which is I don't think that Hamas is really that sophisticated to really have anticipated all of sort of the consequences of what they did. But at the same time, there is something that is really important about the need for a group like that to do something as dramatic and as heinous as they did. And it has to do with the impossibility of telling the story of Palestinian suffering. It really comes down to that. I hate to say it, but it comes down to the fact that the Palestinian is the ultimate imperfect victim. No matter how much suffering they endure, they just can't get to tell their story right because it's always looked at suspiciously. It's always looked at as there is another side to it. And it's also the fact that with the Abraham Accords that we said earlier, which were trying to normalize relations with my own country of origin, Morocco, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan, and now the announcement was going to be made that Saudi Arabia was going to normalize relations with Israel. That also contributed a lot to this complete non-recognition of that suffering. If you remember when Prime Minister Netanyahu was here in the UN just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, he showed a map of the new Middle East, he called it. And he drew with a marker this straight line all the way from Jordan that goes through Israel. There was no Palestine on that map at all. And it went all the way to Europe. And he was talking about how this is going to be this new celebrated Middle East that doesn't have the conflict anymore. And that was, meant to say what we are seeing now, which is that Palestine might actually not exist anymore. Now, I don't know if Hamas is sophisticated enough to have connected the dots there, but they are acting on this total, erasure that keeps happening to them over and over and over again. And that's why it's important to really pay attention. The former correspondent to Jerusalem of The New Yorker said in an op-ed a couple of days ago in The Nation magazine, she said that Israelis and the world have convinced themselves that it's normal to live with the occupation of Palestine. And Tel Aviv has been acting as if it were Miami, she said. And that level of not paying attention that there is an occupation, President Biden said, I strongly recommend and warn Israel not to occupy Gaza again. He failed to say that, Gaza is already occupied. We forget that there is an occupation. And if we want to have a solution, we need to end the blockade, we need to end the occupation, and we need to figure out a way for the refugees to come back or to have some sort of resolution. Short of that, there's not going to be peace. And it's not me just saying this, it's also Israelis who are saying this. We need to amplify those voices because those are the voices of peace. We need to make sure that we reach out to those people instead of listening to Lindsey Graham or Tom Cotton, who I'm sure if you show them a map of the region, they won't know where to locate Israel and Palestine.
Panelists, thank you. Oh, Hillary, did you want to add anything before we close?
I just wanted to say, I think in terms of having a solution, though, I think it's something, though, where I don't know the mechanics of what it would look like. But I think, again, it is very, very clear that there has to be a long-term one, and there has, and again, that there is, that the current situation is no longer sustainable, right? And that it's something where, for people who want to preserve Israel as a state, for people who want there to be a Palestinian state, these things have to exist. There has to be some resolution for both groups to be safe, to be able to live there. And again, most of the people involved are really just like, they just want to raise their kids and have their kids be able to have a good life. And that isn't possible right now.
Panelists, thank you. Definitely appreciate your time, energy, and attention. Audience, thank you for being here. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you for, again, lending your time, energy, and attention and learning with us. We're happy to provide opportunities to continue to educate around the conflicts that are happening, not just here at CU, but around the world. And we sincerely hope that you'll continue to engage with us and learn about, how our world is being impacted on a day-to-day basis. So thank you. Go Buffs. Go Buffs.